Good morning, readers. Well, today is the release of Missing Powers, which is book number 16 in the Reg Rawlins Psychic Investigator series. And so I'm going to do a little reading for you from that today. Keep in mind that I'm still recovering from the flu, so my voice is not the best. I'm hoping that it will last through this reading, but I'm also prepared to hit the pause button in order to cough. So if you see some jumping around, that's probably what's going on. Okay, from the first chapter of Missing Powers. Reg met with Davin for her lesson on fire casting in a forested area outside of Black Sands. The woods in Florida were beautiful, lush green. Davin wore his usual black cloak, hood pulled up over his head so she couldn't see much of his face. He'd been selecting different areas for her to practice in each time they met lately, which she supposed was to help her be prepared to use her craft in whatever circumstances she found herself in. He did seem to prefer remote outdoor locations, easier to avoid detection, less danger if her fire got out of control, assuming that she didn't accidentally start a fire that was too big for Davin to control. She worried about things like that sometimes. She'd had at least one experience where he'd been unable to stop her and didn't want to experience that again. "How are you feeling today?" Devin asked. It was a routine question, but Reg felt something different from him. Not the usual concern for a no. "How are you feeling today?" Devin asked. It was a routine question, but Reg felt something different from him. Not the usual concern of a mentor for the young, red-haired firebrand he was training, but something more, deeper. His dark eyes were piercing under the hood of his cloak. She looked at him, trying to mask her curiosity about his emotions. He would reveal himself sooner or later. If there were something wrong, she would find out. But she didn't want to pry into his personal life. There were things about Davin Smithy she didn't want to know. Reg gathered her red box braids in one hand and pushed them back over her ears and shoulders. She shrugged casually. "I'm fine." "Got a good sleep? Hydrated?" "Yeah, all ready to go." Davin started to form a fireball between his hands, cupping the glowing ball. Reg mimicked him, calling on her own fire. She tried to mimic every movement he made and every change he made to his fire, bigger or smaller, warmer or cooler, changing in color. It was a routine warm-up exercise. "I just wondered how you were handling the news about Corbin." Reg grimaced and kept her focus on her fire, which immediately flared at Corbin's name. She calmed it down again and watched Davin's fire closely for any changes. He would be examining her to see whether she could maintain her focus when he distracted her with talk about her arch-enemy, the Warlock who had once stolen her powers but then given them back to save her, something unheard of for his kind. The Warlock who would like to take them back again and this time keep them for himself. It would be one thing if she and Corbin were just enemies and she could keep a wall between them. But having shared her powers and part of her consciousness, Corbin was bound to her in a way that couldn't be dissolved. They'd helped each other out of sticky or dangerous situations. They'd dated and flirted, and Reg couldn't help but be tempted every time he tried to charm her. But she was strong. She'd learned to use some of the powers that she'd never realized before she took up residence in Black Sands. She could hold Corbin off, usually. If she wanted to, she believed she could overcome him. But she didn't want power over him. She didn't want to destroy him, or take his powers, or to drown him in the depths of the ocean. Usually. There were times. But she tried to suppress those impulses. "Corbin being allowed back into the coven doesn't affect me," she told Davin, keeping her eyes on his ball of fire. "I knew that he was going to be allowed back sooner or later. I don't like it, but I always knew that Corbin being shunned by his coven was only temporary." "You think it is too soon?" "I don't think anything. It isn't anything to do with me. I'm not the one who brought charges against him in the first place. What you people choose to do with him is your business." Davin was part of the tribunal that had judged Corbin and imposed the sentence on him for his attacks on Reg, for breaking a promise and trying to wrest her powers from her without her consent. They didn't care about the time that he had taken her powers because, in their eyes, she'd consented to it, but of course Reg hadn't. She hadn't understood anything about what he was or what he is capable of. She had no idea what she had been agreeing with. She hadn't even understood anything about her powers. She had thought that the voices in her head were just that, voices in her head, not that she was really hearing the voices of those around her, both living and dead. Corbin's silencing of those voices when he took her powers had been terrifying. Reg didn't know how people around her could walk around with empty heads, hearing only their own inner voice. To her, the silence had been like a cacophony, overwhelming and terrifying. Focus, Davin prompted quietly. Reg looked at her own fire, growing smaller and darker. She instantly fed the flames, and it burned brightly. I'm ready to play. Can we get on with it? Reg asked impatiently. I just want to make sure that you're ready, that you're not too distracted. I don't care what Corbin does or what the Coven does with him. He can do whatever he wants. It doesn't have anything to do with me. Let's just play. Throughout Reg's childhood, her various foster parents, teachers, and leaders had always warned her not to play with fire. It was too dangerous. They said she couldn't control what happened once a fire had started. A fire could get bigger, jump to a new location, hurt someone, even hurt Reg herself. Fires were dangerous tools, not for children, not something to play around with or experiment with. But now, with a firecaster for a mentor, Reg was allowed to play with fire, and it was one of the best parts of her week. If Davin would just stick with the lesson and stop trying to distract her with talk about Corbin. Davin gave Reg a tolerant smile. His concern was still there, under the surface. Maybe he was doing more than trying to distract her this time. Maybe he really was worried about her mental state and how the news of Corbin's reinstatement in the Coven had affected her. But it wasn't time to think about Corbin or Davin's concerns. It was time to play. What is your fire drawn to here? Davin asked. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked around. Reg mimicked him, closing her eyes and reaching out with all of her senses, trying to identify what things attracted her fire. Her fire was like a separate entity, a different Reg that dwelt inside her, with its own agenda. She knew it was part of her, but was sometimes surprised at its strength of will, and how it could be so different from her conscious desires. She opened her eyes. There's a crow's nest in that tree. Reg nodded to an ancient tree that towered over them. Very big, lots of sticks that are dry as bone. Davin nodded. And deadfall over here. Reg indicated an area where she could see the trunk of a tree that had fallen years ago. There were other remnants of the trees scattered around it, woods that had been there a long time and had time to dry out. Yes, Davin agreed. Dried mosses. Reg closed her eyes, trying to envision everything clearly in her mind's eye and to feel the stirrings of her fire. Other birds' nests, littler ones. What would you choose to burn? Her mind went again to the crow's nest. It was huge, so much tinder. But she was hesitant to choose a nest. She could see that it wasn't abandoned, but was still in active use. She couldn't tell if there were any eggs in it, but it was home to at least one bird. She turned her mind back to the deadfall. The fallen branches over there, I guess. I could gather them together, make a nice bonfire. A warm feeling in her chest, her fire responding to the idea. Bonfire. Bonfire was good. Why did you discount the nest? There's something still using it, the bird. I don't want to burn up its home. There's other wildlife here, smaller, less visible. Did you consider the creatures that might live in the deadfall? Reg shook her head. Bugs? Termites in the wood or maggots underneath? Gross. No, I don't care about those. Is that the only life that would be affected? Yes. Reg focused on the dry wood again, checking her premise. Was there only insect life? What about mice or squirrels making a home in a hole in the trunk? Woodpeckers drilling for bugs? She couldn't feel anything else and shook her head. I don't feel anything else. You always need to be aware. Sometimes there is more there than you can see. All right, so that is the first chapter from Missing Powers. And you've had a chance to see some of the other pull quotes here and hopefully get excited about this new release. So hop on over to my website or your favorite ebook store to pick it up. And also, if you have not been reading the rest of the series, you can read this one as a standalone. There's enough information in there to understand what's going on. And you can get book one, What the Cat Knew, as a free download on my website. And there are other sales going on at the moment, so take a look. You can also pick up a bundle of the first 12 books in the series and get caught up on your reading of Reg Rawlins' Private Investigator. All right, talk to you next week.